Imagine a place where the fog does not drift in politely from the horizon the way you might picture it, softening edges and settling gently across the water. Imagine instead a fog that arrives sideways, driven hard by Atlantic winds powerful enough to make you lean into them as you walk. A fog so dense on certain mornings that you genuinely cannot see the cliff edge until you are nearly standing on it, cannot see the ocean churning 300 meters below, cannot see the next island in the archipelago even though you know it is sitting right there in the water barely a few kilometers away. Imagine grass so vividly, almost violently green that it seems to glow even on the grayest days, which is most of them. Imagine a landscape where waterfalls launch themselves off cliffs and sometimes, in the strongest gusts, blow entirely back upward before they ever reach the sea below. Imagine looking out across a hillside and counting more sheep than you could count people in the nearest village, and then realizing that this ratio holds true for the entire archipelago you are standing in, where sheep outnumber the total human population by roughly 2 to 1. This is the Faroe Islands, a self-governing archipelago sitting in the North Atlantic Ocean, between Norway, Iceland, and Scotland, belonging to no continent, clinging to no coastline, answering to its own rhythms, in ways that most of the world has barely begun to understand. And if remote, genuinely extraordinary corners of the planet like this one fascinate you the way they fascinate us, go ahead and subscribe right now, because today we are walking through exactly how life actually works for the 53,000 or so people who call this remarkable, fog-wrapped, wind-swept, fiercely beautiful place home. Turn on notifications too, because we have plenty more journeys like this one still ahead of us, and you will not want to miss a single one. The Faroe Islands sit in the northeastern Atlantic Ocean, far enough from everything else to genuinely qualify as one of the more isolated inhabited archipelagos in the entire northern hemisphere, yet not so far that the rest of the world has managed to forget about them entirely. The archipelago consists of 18 islands, 17 of which are inhabited, spread across an area of roughly 1,400 square kilometers of dramatically mountainous, cliff-edged, waterfall-threaded terrain. The nearest substantial neighbor is Iceland, sitting about 430 kilometers to the northwest. Scotland lies roughly 300 kilometers to the southeast, close enough that on very rare, exceptionally clear days, a person standing on the right cliff on the right southern island might catch the faintest suggestion of it on the horizon. Norway sits several hundred kilometers to the east. The Faroe Islands occupy a position that is genuinely in the middle of things geographically, right in the middle of the major shipping lanes between Europe and North America, right in the middle of the flight paths crossing the North Atlantic, and yet somehow, despite all of that proximity and all of those passing ships and planes, managing to feel entirely, wonderfully, defiantly, apart from the world moving around them. The islands were formed by volcanic activity millions of years ago, layers of basalt built up over time into the dramatic cliff faces, steep-sided valleys, and flat-topped mountains that define the landscape today. The highest point, Sleitaratindur, rises roughly 880 meters above sea level, which sounds modest enough until you are actually standing on it in 40-knot winds, with clouds streaming past at eye level and the ocean visible in multiple directions far below. The coastline is extraordinary, a succession of sheer black basalt cliffs dropping hundreds of meters straight into the Atlantic, natural sea stacks and arches carved by waves working at the stone for millions of years, narrow fjords cutting deep inland between steep mountain walls, and small sheltered bays where the island's villages have clustered since people first arrived here more than 1,000 years ago. The Faroese themselves are descended primarily from Norse settlers who arrived during the Viking Age, somewhere around the 9th century, though there is evidence suggesting that Irish monks had already established a presence on the islands before the Norse arrival, drawn by the same quality of isolation that suited contemplative religious life, before being displaced by the incoming settlers. The Norse settlers brought with them the Old Norse language that would evolve over the following centuries into Faroese, one of the most distinctive and in linguistic terms fascinating of all the Germanic languages that descended from that common ancestor, and the agricultural and pastoral traditions centered on sheep, fishing, and the cultivation of small plots of land in whatever sheltered valley floor could be persuaded to grow something useful that would define Faroese life for the better part of a millennium. The name itself, Faroe, or Faroyar, in the Faroese language, is generally understood to derive from the Old Norse word for sheep, a naming decision that tells you something important about the relationship between this archipelago and its most characteristic inhabitants from the very beginning. Sheep arrived with the Norse settlers, thrived in the Atlantic grassland environment, and have been a defining presence on the islands ever since. Grazing freely across hillsides, wandering along cliff edges with an apparent indifference to the vertigo-inducing drops below them, appearing in the middle of the road at the worst possible moments, and outnumbering the human population by a margin that has given the islands one of their most frequently cited and endlessly repeated statistical facts. There are currently somewhere around 80,000 sheep on the Faroe Islands, compared to roughly 53,000 human residents. The sheep have right-of-way in most situations. This is simply understood. Understanding daily life in the Faroe Islands begins with understanding geography, because geography here is not merely a backdrop, it is an active, daily participant in everything that happens. The 18 islands are connected to each other through a combination of roads, tunnels, ferries, and helicopter services, and the infrastructure required to maintain this connectivity across such challenging mountainous and oceanic terrain represents one of the most remarkable ongoing engineering achievements found anywhere in the North Atlantic. The undersea road tunnels bored through bedrock beneath the fjords and channels separating the islands from each other are particularly extraordinary, connecting islands that once depended entirely on boat services with direct road links that function regardless of weather conditions, and the most recently completed of these, which opened in 2020, includes the world's first subsea roundabout, a detail that manages to be both genuinely impressive engineering and unexpectedly charming. Tórshavn is the capital city, and by far the largest settlement in the archipelago, home to roughly 20,000 residents, which makes it the smallest national capital in Europe by population, a distinction it carries with considerable quiet dignity. Tórshavn sits on the southeastern coast of Streymoy, the largest island, clustered around a small natural harbor that has sheltered boats and supported trading activity since the Viking Age. The old town, known as Tinganes, is extraordinary, a small peninsula of narrow lanes lined with traditional Faroese buildings, constructed in the old style, dark wooden walls, with white painted window frames, and roofs covered in turf, the living grass growing from the rooftops, giving these old buildings a distinctly organic quality, as though the landscape itself is slowly reclaiming them in the most gentle possible way. These turf-roofed buildings are one of the most immediately iconic images associated with the Faroe Islands, and seeing them in person, clustered on the old Tinganes Peninsula, against the backdrop of a harbor busy with fishing vessels and the gray Atlantic sky pressing down from above, is genuinely one of those travel experiences that manages to look exactly like photographs you have seen, while simultaneously being entirely different and more vivid and more real. Beyond Tórshavn, the islands contain dozens of smaller villages and settlements, many of them perched in situations that seem almost theatrical in their dramatic improbability. Gásadalur, on the island of Vágar, is perhaps the most frequently photographed village in the entire archipelago, a cluster of perhaps a dozen traditional homes sitting on a clifftop above a waterfall that launches itself directly into the sea below, reachable until relatively recently only by a mountain path so demanding that mail was delivered by a postman who walked it on foot several times each week in all weather. A tunnel now provides road access, which has made daily life considerably less demanding for the handful of residents, while doing nothing to diminish the extraordinary visual drama of the setting itself. Saxon, in a remote valley on Streymoy, sits at the head of a tidal lagoon that fills and empties with the Atlantic tides, backed by steep mountain walls on three sides, its handful of traditional farms, and the small round church at their center, creating a scene so completely removed from anything resembling the modern world that standing there in morning mist feels genuinely disorienting, as though something about the geography itself has managed to hold the 21st century temporarily at bay. Kirkjubor, on the southern coast of Streymoy, contains what may be the oldest inhabited farmhouse in the world, a traditional Faroese longhouse that has been continuously occupied by members of the same family, the Patterson family, for more than 500 years, passing from father to son, across a documented lineage stretching back into the early medieval period. A thread of continuous family occupancy, remarkable enough that it has been formally recognized as one of the more extraordinary examples of living historical continuity found anywhere in Europe. Daily life in the Faroe Islands is shaped above all else by weather, And Faroese weather is not the kind of weather you read about in a meteorological report and then forget. The North Atlantic climate produces conditions that are capable of cycling through what feels like all four seasons within a single afternoon, with sunshine giving way to horizontal rain, which gives way to thick fog, which clears briefly for a rainbow or two, which disappears into low cloud that settles on the mountaintops and stays there, which eventually lifts just enough to reveal a sky of such extraordinary washed clean blue that you are momentarily convinced the whole preceding episode was a misunderstanding. Wind is the constant, the variable that everything else is organized around. Faroese wind is not the pleasant breeze of travel brochures. It is the sustained, powerful North Atlantic variety that can make walking a straightforward pavement route feel like a genuine physical endeavor, that regularly interrupts helicopter services between islands, that carries rain not downward but sideways, with enough force to find every gap in your waterproofing that you thought was theoretical. The Faroese relationship with wind is the relationship of people who long ago accepted something completely outside their control and organized their practical and psychological lives accordingly. You do not complain about the wind in the Faroe Islands. It is simply there, the way gravity is simply there. The Faroese language itself is something worth pausing on, because it represents one of the more remarkable stories of linguistic survival and deliberate cultural preservation found anywhere in the world. Faroese is a North Germanic language descended from Old Norse, closely related to Icelandic, but distinct from it in significant ways, and more distantly related to the Scandinavian languages spoken in Norway, Denmark, and Sweden. For several centuries following the Danish incorporation of the Faroe Islands, Faroese was suppressed as a written language, with Danish used for all official, religious, educational, and formal commercial purposes. Ordinary Faroese people continued speaking their own language in their homes and villages, but an entire generation of children grew up learning to read and write in Danish rather than in their own mother tongue, a situation that carries direct parallels to the experiences of numerous other minority language communities across Europe during similar historical periods. The revival and formal standardization of written Faroese in the 19th and 20th centuries represents a genuinely extraordinary collective cultural achievement, driven initially by linguists and cultural advocates, who recognized both the extraordinary linguistic distinctiveness of the Faroese language and the urgency of establishing a written standard before the shift to Danish literacy became irreversible. Today, Faroese is the official language of the archipelago, used in schools, government, media, literature, music, and everyday public life, while Danish remains widely understood and used for certain official communications with Copenhagen. English is spoken to a high standard by the majority of the younger population, reflecting the international orientation of a small community, well aware that its own language, however beloved, provides limited reach in the wider world. Walking through Tórshavn and listening to the conversations around you in shops, cafes, and on the street, you hear Faroese constantly, a language that sounds to the unprepared ear like something between Old Icelandic and a Scandinavian language you cannot quite identify, full of sounds and rhythms that feel simultaneously ancient and entirely alive in the mouths of people going about their ordinary Tuesday. The Faroese economy has been historically built on fishing, and while it has diversified considerably in recent decades, fishing and fish processing remain by far the most significant economic activity in the archipelago, the foundation on which nearly everything else rests. The waters surrounding the Faroe Islands are among the most productive fishing grounds in the entire North Atlantic, a consequence of the meeting of cold Arctic water masses and the warmer influences of the Gulf Stream, creating conditions that support extraordinary concentrations of Atlantic cod, haddock, sides, herring, mackerel, and a range of other commercially important species. Faroe's fishing vessels range across a wide area of the North Atlantic and into Arctic waters, and the catches they bring home are processed in facilities that collectively represent one of the most technologically sophisticated and export-oriented fish processing industries found anywhere in the world, relative to the size of the population doing it. Aquaculture, specifically the farming of Atlantic salmon in the sheltered fjords and coastal waters between the islands, has grown into a genuinely enormous industry over the past several decades, transforming the Faroese economy in ways that have been broadly positive in economic terms, while generating ongoing, sometimes heated discussion about environmental impacts, the management of sea lice and disease in densely stocked farming environments, and the appropriate balance between the significant economic benefits of fish farming and the protection of the wild fish populations and marine ecosystems of the surrounding waters. Faroese farmed salmon is now exported to markets across Europe, Asia, and increasingly North America, with the industry generating revenue and employment on a scale that makes it impossible to overstate its importance to the overall economic well-being of the archipelago. The relationship between Faroese society and the sea goes considerably deeper than economics alone, reaching into cultural identity, historical memory, and a set of practical skills and traditions that continue to be passed down through communities, even as the technology and scale of modern fishing has transformed the industry beyond recognition from what it was even 2 or 3 generations ago. Older fishermen in villages across the islands can describe childhoods in which going to sea in small open rowing boats was simply part of the rhythm of family life from an early age, when understanding weather patterns, current movements, and the behavior of different fish species was knowledge accumulated through direct observation and passed from parent to child as part of the basic curriculum of how to live in these islands. That direct, embodied relationship with the sea as teacher and provider persists in the cultural consciousness even as modern fishing vessels operate with satellite navigation, sonar fish-finding technology, and refrigerated holds capable of preserving large catches across multiple days at sea. The grindadrap, the traditional Faroese practice of hunting pods of pilot whales when they appear in coastal waters, is perhaps the most internationally controversial aspect of Faroese culture, and no honest account of life in the Faroe Islands can simply pass it by without acknowledgement. The practice involves driving pods of pilot whales into shallow bays, using boats, and then killing them using a combination of traditional tools, with the meat and blubber distributed freely among participants and the local community, rather than sold commercially. Faroese people describe the practice as a deeply rooted tradition, with origins stretching back many centuries, a practice that has historically provided a significant supplement to the diet of communities in an environment where producing sufficient food has never been easy, and one that continues to carry considerable cultural meaning as an expression of community solidarity and connection to ancestral practice. Critics from outside the islands, including international animal welfare organizations, argue that the practice is both unnecessary given contemporary Faroese food security and incompatible with modern standards of animal welfare. This tension between Faroese cultural self-determination and external pressure from international opinion is one that the community engages with actively and defensively, resistant to what many islanders experience as outsiders, presuming to dictate the terms of their own cultural life without genuine understanding of its context or history. It is a genuinely complex subject that illustrates something important about the Faroe Islands more broadly, which is that this is a community small enough in population to be easily stereotyped from the outside, but far too complex and self-aware to be adequately captured by any single narrative, flattering or unflattering. Agriculture in the Faroe Islands has always been challenging, shaped by the rugged terrain, the limited availability of flat cultivable land, the challenging climate, and the relatively short growing season that the latitude and Atlantic conditions combine to impose. The traditional farming pattern that sustained Faroese communities for centuries revolved around a combination of sheep keeping, cattle keeping for dairy products, and cultivation of whatever limited crops the terrain and climate would support, primarily root vegetables and hay for winter fodder. The thin strips of more sheltered, flatter land at the heads of fjords and in valley bottoms were cultivated as intensively as conditions allowed, while the surrounding hillsides and cliff grasslands served as grazing land for sheep moving across the landscape in a pattern managed collectively within each community through traditional arrangements governing access and usage rights that predated anything resembling modern property law by many centuries. Today, virtually all of the basic food consumed in the Faroe Islands beyond what is produced by the fishing and aquaculture industries is imported, making the archipelago heavily dependent on supply chains connecting it to the wider world in ways that would be immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with other isolated island communities. Fresh produce, grain products, most meat beyond locally caught seafood, and the traditional dried and fermented preparations of fish and whale meat, dairy products beyond what local cattle produce, and an enormous range of processed and packaged goods all arrive by ship and plane from Denmark, Norway, and other European suppliers. The cost of living in the Faroe Islands reflects this dependence on imported goods, with prices for many everyday items running noticeably higher than equivalent prices in mainland Scandinavia, representing one of the practical economic realities of island life at this latitude and this degree of separation from major supply centers. Traditional Faroese food culture is genuinely distinctive and, for the uninitiated, sometimes startling in its methods and flavors. Skurpikjot is perhaps the most famous of the traditional preparations, mutton that has been hung in a traditional wooden drying shed called a jalur and allowed to dry and ferment in the Atlantic wind for a period that can range from several months to several years, depending on the desired result. The result is a strongly flavored, dry-cured meat that occupies a position in Faroese food culture roughly analogous to the finest aged charcuterie in any other European tradition. Beloved by those raised on it, and challenging for newcomers encountering the flavor profile for the first time. Rastchot is a similar preparation involving semi-fermented meat that has been allowed to develop a considerably more intense flavor profile than simple air drying produces, while Restur Fisker applies similar principles of controlled fermentation to fish, particularly pollock. These preparations exist because they solved a genuine historical problem: how to preserve food through long North Atlantic winters without refrigeration, in a landscape where salt was historically scarce and expensive, and the solutions they represent have been elevated over generations from mere survival technique into genuinely beloved cultural tradition. Contemporary Faroese restaurant culture, particularly in Tórshavn, has developed a remarkably sophisticated relationship with these traditional ingredients and preparation techniques, with several restaurants receiving international recognition for their work combining classical Nordic culinary technique with traditional Faroese ingredients, including the fermented and cured preparations that might have surprised diners from elsewhere a generation ago. Cox, operating from a remote lakeside location on Streymoy, has held Michelin stars and attracted food travelers from around the world specifically seeking out this particular expression of Faroese culinary identity, a remarkable development for a community of 53,000 people on an island group in the North Atlantic that barely registered on most international awareness at all a few decades ago. Education in the Faroe Islands reflects the priorities of a small, affluent, self-governing community that understands very well the relationship between education, cultural preservation, and the long-term viability of a prosperous society in a world where small populations need to be unusually well-educated to sustain the range of professional specializations a modern society requires. Primary and secondary education is delivered in Faroese, with Faroese language and literature, history, and culture integrated throughout the curriculum alongside the standard range of academic subjects. English instruction begins early and continues throughout schooling, and most secondary graduates emerge with a working proficiency in at least 3 languages: Faroese, Danish, and English, often beginning to acquire competence in a 4th. The University of the Faroe Islands, Fróðskaparsetur Føroya, provides higher education across a range of disciplines, including Faroese language and literature, the natural sciences particularly relevant to the island environment, including marine biology and geology, teacher training, and a growing range of other programs. For many specialized fields, Faroese students still travel abroad, primarily to Denmark, Norway, or the United Kingdom, for university education, creating a familiar pattern of outward flow of young people seeking educational opportunities that the small home population cannot fully provide locally. The question of whether and how many of these students return to the Faroe Islands after completing their education elsewhere is one of the quietly significant demographic and cultural concerns that runs through community discussions about the long-term future, because a community of this size genuinely needs the skilled professionals it trains, and every person who builds their adult life elsewhere represents both a personal choice and a modest collective loss. Healthcare in the Faroe Islands is provided through a publicly funded system, centered on the National Hospital in Tórshavn, Landssjúkrahúsið, which provides the full range of general and specialist medical services that a modern population of 53,000 requires, supplemented by smaller health centers in communities across the other islands. For treatment requiring highly specialized facilities or expertise beyond what the National Hospital can provide, patients are referred to hospitals in Denmark, primarily in Copenhagen, reflecting the ongoing practical relationship with Denmark that shapes so many aspects of Faroese institutional life, even within the context of significant political autonomy. Helicopter services operate specifically to transport patients from the outer islands to Tórshavn when the condition requires rapid medical attention and weather conditions allow flight, and the reliability of these emergency medical connections is something islanders are acutely aware of, particularly in the communities where the geography means a sea crossing forms part of any journey to the main hospital. The political relationship between the Faroe Islands and Denmark is one of the most genuinely interesting and carefully balanced examples of political autonomy found anywhere in the world. The Faroe Islands are not part of the European Union, having voted against joining when Denmark joined in 1973, a decision that has had significant and in many respects positive consequences for the ability of the islands to manage their own fishing waters, negotiate their own fisheries agreements with neighboring countries, and operate their own independent trade relationships to a degree that full EU membership would not have permitted. The islands have their own parliament, the Lagting, which is one of the oldest parliaments in the world, with roots in the Viking Age thing tradition of community assembly and collective decision-making. The Lagting today governs a wide range of domestic matters, including fisheries, education, healthcare, and economic policy, while defense, foreign affairs, and certain other areas remain under Danish national authority. 2 Faroese members sit in the Danish parliament, the Folketing, representing the island's interests within the broader Danish political framework, and the Danish state provides a significant annual block grant to the Faroese government, reflecting both the historical relationship between the two and the practical reality that sustaining full modern government services for a population of 53,000 in one of the more challenging inhabited environments in the North Atlantic requires financial resources that the Faroese economy alone cannot always fully generate. The question of full independence from Denmark is a persistent presence in Faroese political conversation, with different political parties taking significantly different positions on both the desirability and the practical timing and preconditions of any eventual move toward full independence. And these debates reflect genuine, substantive disagreements about economic readiness, currency arrangements, foreign policy implications, and the appropriate pace of a transition that most Faroese people, of all political persuasions, seem to regard as an eventual, rather than immediately pressing question. Religion has played a significant role in shaping Faroese society and culture since the formal Christianization of the islands around the year 1000, attributed in traditional accounts to the Norwegian missionary chieftain Sigmundur Brestesson, who brought Christianity to the islands, according to legend, by the direct and not entirely gentle method of holding a prominent local leader underwater until agreement was reached on the matter of religious conversion. The Lutheran Evangelical Church, the Church of the Faroe Islands, remains the established church of the archipelago and maintains a presence throughout the islands, with a church in virtually every village regardless of how small. These church buildings often being among the oldest and most architecturally significant structures in communities that might otherwise consist primarily of more recent construction. Religious observance remains more genuinely present in everyday Faroese life than in most of comparable northwestern Europe, particularly in the smaller, more traditional communities of the outer islands, where the church continues to function as a significant community gathering point for births, confirmations, marriages, and funerals, the major transitional moments of individual and family life that communities everywhere use to affirm their collective identity and continuity. The Plymouth Brethren movement, which arrived in the Faroe Islands in the 19th century and took particularly strong root in certain communities, continues to have a significant following in parts of the archipelago, sometimes giving communities where its influence is strong a distinctly more conservative social character than prevails in more urbanized Tórshavn. Music has always been central to Faroese cultural life, and the archipelago has produced a music scene of remarkable vitality and originality relative to its tiny population size, ranging from the ancient tradition of Faroese chain dance and the associated medieval ballad form known as the kvæði, to a contemporary music industry that has generated internationally recognized artists across genres, including folk, rock, electronic, and classical composition. The chain dance tradition, in which groups of participants hold hands in a chain or circle and move through a specific pattern of steps while singing ballads that can last for hours, is one of the most distinctive and carefully preserved traditional cultural practices in the entire Nordic world, maintaining a connection to medieval Scandinavian performance tradition that has been lost almost everywhere else but survived in the Faroes, in genuinely living form, rather than as historical reconstruction. The G Festival, held annually on the island of Síðargöta, and the Summer Festivaler in Klaksvík are among the most celebrated music festivals in the region, drawing international artists alongside Faroese performers and attracting visitors from across Scandinavia and beyond, serving both as cultural events and as increasingly significant elements of the tourism offer the islands present to the outside world. Faroese artists including Eivør, whose extraordinary voice and work blending traditional Faroese musical elements with contemporary genres, has brought her international recognition well beyond anything the island's population size might suggest possible, represent a broader pattern of cultural creativity that defies the expectations one might bring to a community this small in this location. Visual art and craft traditions also flourish in the islands, shaped by the extraordinary landscape and light conditions that make the Faroe Islands a genuinely remarkable place to look at and attempt to render in any medium. The quality of light in the Faroe Islands, particularly in the long summer evenings when the sun barely sets and the low-angle illumination catches every detail of cliff and grass and whitewashed wall in ways that transform even an ordinary scene into something of theatrical beauty. Or in the dramatic winter storms when light and darkness and cloud and wind create an atmosphere that seems almost too extreme for everyday life, has long attracted painters and photographers with sufficient courage to work outdoors in the conditions the climate provides. A community of contemporary Faroese visual artists working in a range of styles, from realistic landscape tradition to contemporary abstraction, has developed particularly since the establishment of the Faroe Islands Art Museum in Tórshavn, which provides both exhibition space for established artists and a context for understanding how Faroese visual culture has developed across the past century and a half. Knitting is another tradition of particular significance in Faroese cultural life, connected directly to the wool produced by the sheep that have been central to island life since the Norse settlement. Traditional Faroese knitwear, characterized by specific patterns and color combinations developed over generations, continues to be produced both in traditional form by knitters maintaining a direct connection to the historical technique, and in updated contemporary designs that maintain references to traditional pattern vocabularies while adapting them for modern fashion contexts. The distinctive natural colors of Faroese wool, ranging from white through grays and browns and near black, reflecting the natural coat colors of the sheep breeds that have developed in these islands over many centuries, are part of what gives traditional Faroese knitwear its particular character, available in the craft shops of Tórshavn to visitors who recognize quality when they encounter it. Architecture in the Faroe Islands encompasses a striking range from the ancient turf-roofed buildings of Tinganes and the scattered historic farms of the outer islands to genuinely ambitious contemporary Nordic architecture that has been making the islands increasingly attractive to architectural enthusiasts who would not necessarily have had them on their radar even a decade ago. The Nordic House Cultural Center in Tórshavn, designed by the Danish architects who brought a sophisticated Scandinavian modernist sensibility to the commission, and the extraordinary new National Gallery, represent a broader investment in cultural infrastructure that reflects the Faroese community's commitment to building institutions appropriate to a confident, self-aware, small but culturally serious society. Meanwhile, in villages across the islands, the traditional relationship between architecture and landscape continues to produce results of particular beauty. Homes and churches and fishing sheds built low against the hillside or tucked into the valley floor, using local stone and traditional forms that have been refined over generations to manage the wind, the rain, and the particular demands of this environment, with a quiet, practical elegance. Sport plays a significant role in Faroese community life, with football being the dominant sporting passion in a way that has somewhat surprised the wider football world over the past few decades. The Faroe Islands national football team has operated as a fully independent entity within FIFA and UEFA since 1988, and in that time has produced a series of results that have earned the islands a level of sporting recognition far beyond what a population of 53,000 might be expected to generate. The legendary match against Austria in 1990, played on a grass pitch in Sweden rather than on the artificial surface the islands used domestically at the time, which ended in a 1-0 Faroese victory and sent shockwaves through the European football establishment, remains the founding moment of what has become a genuinely respected small-nation football culture, built on extraordinary local passion, high participation rates, and a development system that has gotten increasingly sophisticated results from what are inevitably very limited raw materials. Domestic football in the Faroe Islands revolves around the Faroese Premier League, a competition contested by clubs from communities across the islands that generates substantial local engagement and genuine community pride in the specific club identities that have developed over the decades. Playing football in the conditions the Faroese climate provides is itself a particular discipline, with the strong winds that characterize the islands demanding a specific tactical and technical adjustment that Faroese players develop as a matter of basic necessity and that gives Faroese football its own distinctive character. Swimming, athletics, handball, and a range of other sports also maintain significant participation numbers, reflecting a community that places considerable value on physical activity and collective sporting engagement. The village community structure remains the fundamental social unit of Faroese life, in ways that distinguish the archipelago meaningfully from the more anonymized patterns of social life found in larger, more urbanized societies. Even as Tórshavn has grown and modernized, drawing residents from the smaller outer islands and developing the full range of commercial and social amenities expected in a capital city of any size, the identification with specific village communities remains genuinely significant for Faroese people, shaping social networks, sporting allegiances, family connections, and a persistent sense of belonging to something smaller and more specific than simply the nation as a whole. This village identity is partly a consequence of the geography itself, since the mountains, fjords, and channels separating communities created conditions under which each village developed as a largely self-sufficient unit for much of its history, building institutions, traditions, and social norms specific to its own particular situation and needs. The annual village festivals and community celebrations that punctuate the Faroese calendar remain genuinely significant occasions, drawing residents back to their home communities even after they have moved to Tórshavn or other larger settlements for work or education, reinforcing the community bonds that geography and history established and that contemporary Faroese society continues to value as a meaningful counterweight to the homogenizing pressures of modern life. Olavsøka, the National Day celebration held in Tórshavn in late July around the feast day of Saint Olav, is the largest and most significant of these collective celebrations. A two-day festival that draws people from across the archipelago to the capital for a combination of formal parliamentary opening ceremony, traditional chain dancing in the streets, music performances, rowing boat racing in the harbor, and a general atmosphere of national celebration and community gathering that manages to feel simultaneously ancient in its roots and completely contemporary in its expression. Rowing occupies a particular place in Faroese sporting and cultural tradition, connected directly to the historical dependence on boats for both fishing and inter-island travel that shaped Faroese life for centuries. Traditional Faroese rowing boats, the six-oared type known as the seksæringur, and the larger eight-oared type, are still built by craftsmen, maintaining the traditional wooden boat-building skills. And races between these traditional vessels at regattas around the islands generate the kind of genuine community passion and competitive pride that reveals how deeply these connections to historical practice continue to matter in contemporary life. Inter-village rowing competitions carry social significance well beyond simple athletic competition, representing an expression of community identity and collective pride with roots extending back to a period when the boats being raced were the same vessels that the racers' ancestors used to sustain their lives. Daily life in Tórshavn has a quality that visitors who have been expecting something either considerably more remote and primitive or considerably more modern and anonymous than the reality tend to find genuinely surprising and almost immediately appealing. The city is compact enough to walk across in half an hour under ordinary conditions, and it is organized around the harbor and the old Tinganes Peninsula in a way that keeps the historical core of the settlement visible and present, even amid the cafes, shops, hotels, government offices, and cultural institutions of a functioning 21st-century small city. The main shopping street, Niels Finnsensgøta, offers the retail mix of any small Nordic town: clothing shops, pharmacies, supermarkets stocked with a combination of Faroese and imported goods, bookshops carrying Faroese language publications alongside Danish and international titles, cafes where the coffee is taken seriously in the Nordic fashion and where conversations in multiple languages overlay each other comfortably. The standard of living in the Faroe Islands is high by any European measure, reflecting the considerable prosperity generated particularly by the salmon farming industry and the broader fishing economy over recent decades. Unemployment is structurally very low. Housing quality is generally high. Public services are well-funded and broadly effective, and the combination of economic security, clean environment, extremely low crime rates, and the extraordinary natural landscape creates living conditions that many Faroese people, asked directly about why they live here rather than somewhere larger and less weathered, describe simply as the best in the world, with a directness that is not boasting but simply an honest statement of genuine contentment with the particular combination of things this place provides. Tourism has grown into an increasingly significant component of the Faroese economy over the past decade, as the islands have become progressively better known internationally as a destination offering something genuinely different from the typical European travel experience. The landscape has been the primary draw. The extraordinary scenery of cliffs and fjords and waterfalls and improbable villages that has made the Faroe Islands one of the most photographed destinations in the Nordic world, despite its relatively tiny visitor numbers compared to the major tourist destinations of Europe. The islands have been thoughtful and sometimes deliberately cautious about tourism development, engaging in experiments with volunteer-based tourism, in which visitors contribute physical labor to conservation and landscape maintenance projects in exchange for access during certain periods, reflecting both a practical need for conservation work and a considered positioning around what kind of tourism relationship with the outside world best suits this particular community. The challenge of managing the growing international attention that the Faroe Islands' extraordinary landscape generates, while preserving the qualities of that landscape and the character of the communities within it that make it extraordinary in the first place, is one that Faroese authorities and communities take seriously, approaching it with the kind of careful deliberation that a small, self-governing community with genuine control over its own territory can afford to exercise in ways that larger, more open economies often cannot. Visitor numbers remain modest by global standards. The infrastructure is deliberately kept at a scale appropriate to a sustainable, small-volume, high-quality visitor economy, and the conversation about what kind of tourism the islands want and on whose terms continues actively in local political and community discussion, in ways that reflect a genuine collective investment in getting it right, rather than simply maximizing short-term revenue. Working life in the Faroe Islands is shaped by the same combination of economic structure, geography, and cultural priorities that shapes every other aspect of daily existence. The dominant employers across the archipelago include the fishing and aquaculture industries, public services including healthcare, education, and government administration, the construction sector, which remains active given ongoing infrastructure investment, retail and service sector businesses of various kinds, and an increasingly significant technology and financial services sector that has developed in Tórshavn over recent decades, attracted partly by the availability of well-educated multilingual workers and the high quality of the telecommunications infrastructure the islands have invested in maintaining, despite the challenging geography. Working hours and workplace culture in the Faroe Islands reflect broader Nordic values around work-life balance, with the combination of relatively reasonable working hours, generous parental leave provisions, and the proximity of most residents to extraordinary outdoor recreation in literally every direction contributing to a quality of daily working life that consistently registers very favorably in whatever measures of life satisfaction and well-being are applied to the Faroese population. The work is often demanding in the traditional sectors, particularly at sea, where the North Atlantic fishing environment is as physically and practically challenging as any working environment in the world, requiring both technical skill and a genuine physical robustness that the Faroese fishing community has maintained across generations. But the rewards, both financial and in terms of the sense of participating in something fundamental to the community's identity and economic life, continue to make fishing and related maritime work meaningful and sought after rather than merely default employment. The housing market in the Faroe Islands, particularly in Tórshavn, has seen considerable price increases over the past decade, reflecting both the economic prosperity generated by the salmon farming industry's success and the relatively constrained land supply available in a mountainous archipelago where buildable flat land is not in enormous supply. This has created challenges for younger Faroese people attempting to establish themselves on the housing market in the capital, a familiar story in prosperous small communities, where economic success and limited land supply combine to push housing costs toward levels that require significant financial resources or family support to navigate. The government and municipal authorities have engaged with this challenge through various housing policy measures, recognizing that unaffordable housing for younger residents represents a genuine threat to the demographic sustainability of the community over time. Telecommunications and digital connectivity in the Faroe Islands are genuinely impressive, reflecting a community that recognized early the potential of digital technology to offset some of the practical disadvantages of geographic isolation. High-speed internet service is widely available across the islands, and mobile connectivity extends further into the landscape than might be expected, given the rugged terrain and the small population density across much of the archipelago. This digital infrastructure has been economically significant, enabling remote working arrangements and digital business models that have allowed some Faroese people to build careers in globally connected fields while continuing to live in the islands and supporting the technology sector businesses that have established themselves in Tórshavn over recent years. The Faroese' interest in and engagement with environmental sustainability reflects both practical awareness of living in an environment where the consequences of poor stewardship would be immediately visible and directly harmful, and broader Nordic cultural values around environmental responsibility that have shaped policy and public attitude across the region. The fishing industry, which has historically been central to the Faroese economy, has experienced